Hello, everybody. This is the program on constitutional government. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and our guest today is Graeme Wood. Graeme Wood is a national correspondent for The Atlantic, and he's a journalist, but he's also a lecturer at Yale University in political science. He went to college at Deep Springs and for 2 years, and then graduated from Harvard. And he has a degree from the American University in Cairo. He writes on diverse topics from every continent. He's been everywhere. And his article in 2015 in The Atlantic called "What ISIS Really Wants" was the most read article that a journalist has ever had. And in 2017, he wrote this splendid book, "The Way of Strangers: Encounters with the Islamic State." So he's going to speak today on liberalism and despotism in the Middle East. Graeme Wood, hello.
Harvey, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. The invitation to be here is in a micro way, a way for me to remedy an error that I made years ago in not taking Harvey's class. So it's rare that later in life, in middle age, you get a chance to just fix one of one's youthful, stupid errors. But being in the room next to Harvey is a privilege, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to be here. So I'm going to talk today about, I know this is a program on constitutional government, and it's ironic because the governments that interest me are like the least constitutional that can possibly be conceived. So I thought I would just lean into that a bit. Constitutional in the normal sense of having some kind of written down limits on power. And the Islamic State, Saudi Arabia, two cases of conspicuous absolute authority being vested in an individual, the king of Saudi Arabia in one case, and the caliph at the head of the Islamic State in the other. So what I do is, as Harvey mentioned, it's journalistic. I don't look at these things like a political theorist, but I go places, put miles on rental cars going around countries and talking to whoever I can find who will talk to me. And what you do sometimes get is a sense of how people understand power in the countries where you go. And one of the aspects of the reporting art is finding people who will actually talk to you about these things. In the case of the Islamic State, no one ever was able, as a journalist, an independent journalist, to talk to the caliph in whom that absolute power resided. So it was a matter of finding people who, in ISIS, were able to talk to me about how they understood this entity, how they understood it to derive its power, how they understood it to wield its power. And then in an interesting reversal in Saudi Arabia, it's the opposite, where you go to Saudi Arabia, which has always been a fairly repressive government, and never more than right now. You can talk to anybody you want to, and they won't talk to you about that topic in particular. They will not say anything about how power actually works. But in my case, I was able actually to talk to the sovereign. I was able to talk to the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who for a couple years, roughly, before I spoke to him, had spoken to no outsiders, no independent journalists, and who hasn't spoken to anyone since. So I had conversations with him that went into the hours, and was able to have the beginnings of a sense of how he thinks about absolute power, absolute executive authority, and what that looks like. So what I'm just going to do is walk through these two entities that are tyrannies, I suppose you could say, in at least, and maybe in at least a classical sense, and maybe in another sense too, of having people who are in power who have not come to power in the usual accepted or natural way, at least in living memory. So in the case of the Islamic State, of course, we haven't had a caliph since 1923. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we haven't had someone who, although he's appointed crown prince by a king, and that is how one becomes crown prince, we haven't had someone who came to power in that way from that generation and in the dramatic way that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did. So, I'll talk about the Islamic State first. There is a long history of entities that preceded the Islamic State, which called themselves by different names: the Islamic State in Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and something very interesting happened in 2014 with the rise of the Islamic State itself. So what were those predecessor entities? Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization is one way to describe it. A military organization, another way to describe it. It was a group of people who regarded itself as a military vanguard for a state that did not yet exist. And then even when this entity in different local franchised forms did describe itself as a state, it still was that. It still was what Al-Qaeda was, in that it was regarding itself as a military vanguard that was run by an emir. And emir, this is an English word too, but in Arabic, its basic root is that it's someone who can give orders, someone who has say-so. And that's all it is. It's a functional military way of organizing a group where there's a guy at the top and people report to him. That's all it is. The person who has say-so. And when we have in Dubai or in Qatar governments that are headed by emirs, and this is a bureaucratized form of power, but in the militarized sense, it's much less so. It's a small terrorist group. What happened in 2014, though, is quite interesting. So I think all of you probably remember in broad strokes what happened, the declaration of a caliphate. And what had called itself previously the Islamic State in Iraq, then the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL or ISIS, Arabic word for the Levant is Sham, suddenly became the Islamic State. And there was this strange, to outsiders in particular, ontological shift that happened that mattered a lot to how people conceived of the sources of legitimate authority for that group, where the emir, he stayed emir, but they added to the title emir of the believers, which is a term that historically in early Islam was exactly synonymous and coextensive with caliph, which is a term in turn that was reserved for the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, or in some minority views to God himself. And the term, just as I love these little etymological sidelines, so I hope you love them too. The word caliph, it comes from the root khalafa, which means to succeed or come after. And the exact antonym of that is salafa. So if any of you know the word Salafi, that it means to come before or precede. So khalafa, salafa. It gives you a sense of why, and the followers of the Islamic State were overwhelmingly Salafi. So that gives you a sense of how important this directionality was, looking back, looking forward. And the Salafis are people who look back to the earliest pious ancestors of Islam, and in a quasi-Amish kind of way, want to go back to those ways of being, those interpretations of law, those theological commitments. So that change, when it happened, suggested that there was the whole point of this change and why it was so electrifying was that there was a change in the way that the state was configured and the change in the kind of authority that this person had, where before there was a contractual relationship that the emir had with his followers. And then subsequently, there was still a contractual relationship that the emir had with his followers, but there was an individual obligation on followers to enter into that contract. And so the contract is a loyalty oath, and they would give what was it's called bay'ah. It's a loyalty oath that can exist also in a secular context. And the king of Saudi Arabia, for example, gets, when he takes the throne, gets bay'ah from his subjects too. So at that point, though, and what allowed him to become caliph, going back into classical Islamic law, there are certain obligations or certain traits that a caliph must have, some of which have been honored less consistently than others in the history of caliphates, where a caliphate must be an adult Muslim male with authority over territory and authority over people, and also must be physically and mentally intact. So that means you can't be missing an arm or digits. You can't be missing an eye, which actually turns out to matter because of that previous criterion that you have to be able to have command over people, which means you've likely been in battle, which historically means you've likely had something hacked off at some point. So that actually disqualifies a lot of people. And if you look, for example, at the Taliban, Mullah Omar was famously missing an eye. So one of the reasons that he was considered ineligible for this position was that. Another, though, was that you have to be from the tribe of Quraysh. It has to be an adult Muslim male who is Qurayshi. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of the Islamic State, was that. So fulfills all these criteria, and then is the first one past the post by actually declaring himself to be the caliphate. And now, at that point, he has this supreme executive authority that he wields over the caliphate and everybody who has sworn allegiance to them, and they have, the Muslims who have not sworn allegiance to him have the obligation, allegedly, to do so. But at that point, it starts to get kind of interesting, because if it were just a simple matter of the person who's in charge of the caliphate says he has say-so, the way that it would be if he were the emir of a military organization, then it would be simple. But I'll read to you one of the things that he said in the address that he gave, which this amazing moment when this shadowy figure who had never appeared ever in public suddenly shows up with like a camera just like that one running, and you get to hear what he says without notes and see his expressions and so forth. He said, "I was appointed as a leader for you, although I am not the best of you, nor am I better than you. Therefore, if you see that I am in the right, then aid me. And if you see me in the wrong, then advise me. Obey me as long as I obey God in your regard." So this note of humility is actually a nearly exact quote, actually, from the first Sunni caliph, Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, who said exactly this when he took over after the death of the Prophet. And so a note of humility, on the other hand, a direct comparison it's as if quoting George Washington's inaugural address as a note of humility. Incidentally, it's exactly the quote that was used by Muhammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood when he became the leader of Egypt for that brief period. So the original caliph, this companion of the Prophet, he starts by emphasizing, although he asserts total executive power, he begins by emphasizing the limitations on that power. Begins by saying those who are following him should stop following him if he goes on the wrong path. And that's the tension that that's going to come back over and over in the remarks that I have today. There's the part where you take the power, you assert power, and the part where you then say, oh, but there's this limitation, there's that limitation, and in fact, those limitations are necessary components of the executive power that I've just asserted that was apparently unlimited in the way that I assert it, and in the rights that I in operation will assert for myself. So it's a very funny dialectic that, as you'll see, will come up when I talk about Saudi Arabia too. Moreover, when you talk to the supporters of the group, they seem, in addition to having sworn in this profound sense of having agreed that he's the leader of the religion that will save their souls, one would think that this would mean you have a high opinion of the person to whom you're swearing your loyalty. And in fact, it was very difficult to find anyone who had a strong view about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They instead would look with a kind of baffled, bemused annoyance when I would ask questions about Baghdadi. They would say, they wouldn't, if I asked about his qualities, his wisdom, his fitness for the role, his personality, all I wanted was to get a sense of the mythos and the charisma about this individual. And always there was an attempt to minimize that rather than to suggest that there was a mark of election about him, that God had chosen him, and that this monumental, unseen for a century ontological change in him, that it mattered. So they'd say instead things that were in effect they were, he's just a guy. When he's gone, we'll get another one. We'll go to the caliph getting place and find another guy who has all his limbs and his eyes and has the right Ancestry.com profile. And they'd talk about, usually rather than talking about, although he was in some ways a impressive figure. His Arabic was certainly better than mine, but those who have Arabic much better than mine also say that his Arabic was much better than theirs. So he had marks of erudition about him, and they would sometimes talk about that. But more often they would say these tales, almost certainly apocryphal, of his having engaged in the day-to-day governance of the state in ways that were not always in his favor. Getting in fender benders and then submitting to the authority of minor local judges about his having to pay some other guy for $40 to replace the bumper of his Toyota. So that's the figure who was occupying this position of great authority. Someone whose authority was constantly diminished, first by him and then by the people who were following him. So the other aspect of this is that when people talk about the obligations that they incurred to the caliph, they would talk about the bidirectionality of this contract. Like all contracts, there's the give and there's the take from both sides, and they would say, we owe him general obedience, and in return, he owes us quite a lot of things. That this caliph, he was not someone who we obey him and he does what he likes with us. He can dispose of us at will. They would immediately, especially the ones I spoke to were overwhelmingly from outside of the region, but they would suddenly start invoking the obligations that they were used to invoking about the states that they came from. They would mention, oh, so he's the state that we're swearing ourselves to, and we expect the state to give us all the basic stuff. Safety, security, it should monopolize legitimate force, and it should, they would say, also, I think they should give us a bunch of social welfare goodies too. Healthcare. One of them said to me, the NHS gives us dental, gives us medical, the caliphate's going to give us vision too. Vision in the most quotidian sense of new lenses and frames every couple of years. So this executive authority that seemed at the beginning and rhetorically was always claiming for itself extraordinary powers, was also implicated in lots of expectation that were openly expressed, and of course not always fulfilled. There was a lot of sort of gimme attitude that you'd hear from people. So they didn't quite go to the point, though, of saying, and maybe this shows that there's a limit to what their expectations were, that if it didn't provide dental, then he's no longer caliph. It didn't mean that if there were still unpunished brigands in the highways between cities in the Islamic State, that the caliph had ceased to have that authority. So maybe this was just rhetorical, but it was just noteworthy that what was asserted as total authority was, in a sense, a kind of foundational total authority that gave way to much diminished authority in day-to-day operation. That contrast I thought was interesting. So now onward to the Saudi stuff. The Saudi monarchy, just some basic background about it. It's sometimes described as the last absolute monarchy on earth. Not quite so. I mean, there's Brunei, and then there's certainly other places that are not monarchies in name, but seem to have hereditary absolute power characteristics. Not difficult to name too many of those. The Saudi monarchy, though, is interesting in that it is one of the few that dares to speak its name as an absolute monarchy. It describes itself that way. It often acts that way, but it is also sort of like the Islamic State in this regard. There's the part where you assert total power, total authority, and then there's the part where you stop, the part where you beg not to be held responsible and to be not treated as if your authority is total. So the Saudi monarchy, it is pre-modern. Curiously, though, it's pre-modern without being old. Although it's true that the Saudi monarchy is run by a family that has had power in Central Arabia for hundreds of years, the Saudi monarchy in the current form dates only back to around 1930. And since I started off by talking about the Islamic State, in the way that the sort of historiography of the Islamic State is that Saudi Arabia, up until about that point, was on the right track. They were doing fine. They had the right views on religion, and politics. They didn't have a caliph, but they were headed in that direction. And then around 1930, with the death of the senior cleric in the kingdom, Suleiman ibn Sihman, they faced a fork in the road, and they took the wrong one. The correct path would have been doing a number of things that Ibn Sihman was urging on the secular leadership of the country, such as not allowing its citizens to go abroad except for fairly specific reasons. If you go abroad, it better be for limited purposes of commerce or proselytization. Similarly, there's this Roach Motel aspect of the Islamic State. If you go there, you don't go out ever in any normal circumstance. So Saudi Arabia, its clergy were saying it should be like that. Similarly, it shouldn't recognize the existence of its borders. So as of 1920, there were a lot of dotted lines on that map around Saudi Arabia, and there was an understanding that we do not run our state like a Westphalian state that stops at a certain point and then suddenly the keys to the castle are held by someone else. Instead, we never will acknowledge that it stops somewhere. There's some undefined point between this sovereign and the next. And then Saudi Arabia at that point had the choice: do we become like one of those Westphalian states? Do we allow foreigners to come in, and do we allow our citizens to go out and live there permanently? Do we exchange ambassadors? And they answered yes, 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 yes. And once oil is discovered, absolutely yes. This was great. So the Saudi monarchy since then has had a few general waves. There was the 1930 to 1953 period when the founder of the kingdom, King Abdulaziz, who was a real warlord, I mean, in the very old-fashioned sense of conquering cities, consolidating power. He was a desert warlord. He was king during that period. And then 1953 to the present day, during which the sons of Abdulaziz have been the only kings. And they have, without exception, the Saudi kings since then have been the sons of Abdulaziz. And getting older and older and older as time has gone by. So the baby of the clan, Salman, is the current king. He's 86 years old, I believe, and not a youthful 86 like some of us in this room have been very recently, but an aged 86. And there's a lot of course, interest in what happens next. What happens when the next generation takes over? And that is what has happened with MBS. I mentioned that just as the caliph came to power in an unusual way, MBS did too, because in the past it had simply been which brother is still standing, which one hasn't demonstrated some deep defect in his governing ability. And some of them have had these deep defects and have quietly just not been considered plausible candidates for the throne. To now we've got a lot of people in a new generation to choose from. And the choice was Mohammed bin Salman, who's 36 years old, and who has a number of unusual characteristics for a Saudi king or crown prince, in addition to the generational one, that one might expect a modern Saudi king to have been chosen, a crown prince to have been chosen because he is worldly, because he has studied abroad, as many Saudi royals have. One of his brothers has a doctorate from Oxford. Another one went to outer space. So this is not an unworldly family, but instead the one who's chosen is the one who has barely left the kingdom, who has occupied no office of any real importance before he's elevated to this role, and who is mostly an aide-de-camp to his father during his father's decades in control of the government of Riyadh. So his father, now king, chooses that one, MBS. And the conversations with MBS show, again, a real discomfort with both an embrace of the awesome power that he nominally has, and then there's the part where you assert executive power, and there's the part where you say it's not actually mine to wield. So in the Saudi monarchy, it couldn't be simpler, the way that power works on paper. All power resides in the king, and any power that you might have is power that he has given to you provisionally. It is not power that inheres in your rights as a person. It is not power that you have as a citizen. It is power that he has granted and that he can take away at any point. If there were a constitution, it would be 3 words. It would be power flows downhill. That's it. And one way that has flowed downhill is the appointment of the crown prince, who has the title of prime minister now, who's understood by all to be running the country, and who has, in fact, the title of emir, the guy who gives the orders. So he has near plenipotentiary power over what goes on. And I won't talk about all of his policies, but he has undertaken this modernizing campaign where a number of things that through most of our lives have been signature aspects of the kingdom, including extreme religious conservatism, being closed off to the world. These things are all changing very, very fast, and there have been some doubts expressed by American politicians, Saudi watchers from the outside, about the authenticity of these changes. One of the things that I first wanted to do after deciding that I was going to go to Saudi Arabia for months is just make sure that they were actually happening, and I think they are. I think they are real. They are real, and they are costly, and they're largely welcomed, especially in big cities. But they're not just illusory, as I think a lot of people thought that they were. So let's talk about the absolute aspects of this. When talking to MBS, he was not shy in the slightest about expressing the absoluteness of his power. And there are a number of ways that he did this. He's answering these questions off the cuff, and without notes, preparation, or knowledge of what I would ask. And I'd asked him, for example, about this operation very early in his time as Crown Prince, where he took basically a whole bunch of his relatives and others who were not his relatives but were hugely powerful within the kingdom, and then put them in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and then surrounded it by security, and just one by one shook them down and said, "My understanding is you've been naughty in the past. You've taken money that was not yours. This was the way that Saudi Arabia was before. And guess what? Now is your chance to make amends for this. Give back what you've taken and never do it again. Maybe give back 95% of what you've taken." So a lot of money was taken back, and a lot of people who were viewed as king material, or at least power material, were put in their place. And I asked him, might one not think about this as a way of eliminating rivals and consolidating power? And his immediate reaction was to say, "What rivals? I eliminated them long ago. This does not compute. You do not understand how the system works if you think I have rivals." And he didn't just mean that in the sense of the intimidation that I'm doing is something that I was doing a long time ago. What he also was saying was that there is a particular way that power works. If I had a rival, that rival would be called Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But if you have been invested with this authority by the king, then you have the power, and I had the power. So there's no rivalry that has to be tamped down by this. Similarly, another example of the kind of intuitive sense of where power comes from in his mind and in the formal model of Saudi power. I mentioned that he was a modernizer. This includes things like allowing women to drive. There were activists who spent years saying women should be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. And MBS, I have no doubt, thought that they were right. He thought that women should be allowed to drive much earlier than they were actually allowed to drive. And so people were put in jail because of their activism for supporting a policy that MBS supports. Why? Because they were not correct in the way that they asserted it as one of their rights. It was not their right to drive because they have a right to drive. They have a right to drive only because MBS says so, with the authority of the king. So all of this, again, power flowing downhill. Now, what was interesting, though, as a journalist, what one looks for often is people say things and then they say something else, and these are different. And trying to figure out what the sources of these inconsistencies are, how people understand them, why they, and just taking note of apparent tensions. And in this case, his assertion of power and then the denial of power, sometimes, but not always, by passing the buck to his father, the source of ultimate power, which of course would be consistent. So when I would ask about fundamental changes to the kingdom, you're trying to get the world to like you, maybe some things you could do would be to have basic acknowledgement of human rights. Some of the things that are kind of non-negotiable in much of the world, non-negotiable aspects of what it means to play fair. And immediately he gets sociological. He says, do you understand how Saudi Arabia works? My father, he said, is the monarch. He's the king of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is a system of monarchies, thousands of monarchies. It's monarchies all the way down. Every monarch is subject to some other monarch. And he said, it's a fascinating claim. He said there's tribal monarchies, there's urban monarchies, there's structures of clan, of family, of religion, of business. And all of these depend on this kind of power flowing downhill model, where if you suddenly say that everybody has a little bit of power, then do you realize how crazy this will become trying to manage the monarchies all the way down? He says, look, I cannot, he told me, perform a coup against millions of people. So the tension's pretty obvious. I have total power, but that does not include the power not to have total power, because I derive my power from the base of this infinite pyramid, which is where the underlying total power resides. He's also been, he's been famously tough on dissidents, and I would ask him, why don't you follow the model of some of your peers around the region who have offered amnesties, let people out of jail, just ease up a little bit. I mean, you say you have no rivals, that suggests that you can ease up. And then he would say, well, first of all, the king has the power to pardon, but he never exercises that power. And he cannot exercise that power in a responsible way, not because of a defect in him, but because the system has to have a way of working, that he has total power, but not power enough to interfere effectively within the bureaucracy, the criminal system within the kingdom. So, in one sense you could say, well, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, has pardon power, but we would object if he were just handing out pardons left, right, to whoever happened to talk to him that day, and we would object because it would cause the justice system not to work in any number of ways. But I think there is a difference, in other words, between denying that you have executive authority and then claiming that it should be exercised judiciously. But I think even this claim that there's reasons of prudence not to exercise that power are noteworthy. I mean, it's distinctive, at least in the Saudi context, to say, I can't do it, the courts have to do their job. That's not something that I could imagine a desert warlord like his grandfather, on whom he models himself clearly, saying. Abdulaziz would say, I believe, this is something that I can do, and I'll do it when I damn well please. Not, this is something that I can do, but there's a lot of courts that people depend on, and they have to have their authority. This is a change. So one of the last questions that I asked him, and I saved it for last in part because I thought it would be it's one of the most sensitive questions in the kingdom, of line of succession. So when you are king, you choose your crown prince, and that crown prince usually stays crown prince, doesn't always, but biology might cause the need for another crown prince if the first one dies or becomes incapacitated. Mohammed bin Salman's father, the king, has changed some of the rules of succession, as he can do unilaterally, so that MBS, should he become king, cannot choose as his successor anyone in the same branch of the family, which would exclude his children, would exclude his siblings. So MBS, being a young man, he might have 50 years in power, but 50 years from now, according to this rule, power has to shift really far away, which is odd. Now, of course, I asked him, I tried to get him to commit, is that your reading too of the way that this succession plan works? And he said, yes, that is my reading of how it works. I cannot choose my brother, I cannot choose my children. Now, a king unilaterally made this rule, and he's going to be king soon, and he can unilaterally change it too. But he did reply that this was his understanding. His hands are tied on this, which is in some way the most important issue at any given moment in the kingdom. So, and I'll come to an end here. You start to see some commonalities. There's a theory of total executive authority as a foundational principle, and then a denial of that claim sometimes in general, sometimes in individual cases. And I'll just put out there a couple possible fairly obvious interpretations of what's going on. One might be that we're kind of just living in the end of the era of caliphs and princes in the classical sense of that absolute authority. Because what could be less prince-like than spending all your time denying that you're a prince, or that you're a caliph with the favor of God. The other, maybe more cynical approach would be to say that this denial of power is actually an exercise of power. This is the way that you exercise power in a world that has many people in it who don't think of absolute monarchy as a norm, is by invoking the authority that you derive only from the bureaucracies that are beneath you and the people who are your subjects. And then you can deny that, of course, selectively, opportunistically, and you can make every easy choice can be yours to make. Every hard one is someone else's that's been foisted upon you by the way the world works. So, and then I guess the other question is whether this second option, if that's what's going on, is actually just a form of the first. That is, if absolute authority is having to deny itself in this opportunistic way, over the course of time, is that one of the ways that it turns into fettered authority? I mean, one of the takeaways that I had after looking at Saudi Arabia, seeing these changes, seeing how they were working, seeing how so many of them were becoming fait accompli. These were changes a long time coming and very difficult to reverse. How does one read that if you're watching how absolute monarchies of centuries past have shifted slowly beyond the scale of individual human lifetimes into constitutional monarchies? Do they begin by first denying themselves, first rhetorically and opportunistically saying that this authority is limited, and then at what point in say the British monarchy did that become first in fact no longer absolute authority, and then finally formally no longer absolute authority? It wasn't fast. It was a slow process, and when it finally changed nominally, it was not a cataclysmic change. You might be seeing something like that in Saudi Arabia or in these monarchies. Is the beginning of that slow process that the speed of which I wouldn't want to speculate on, but it could be long enough that we don't see the end of it, but it is heading in that direction. With that, I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question to start with, maybe. These two regimes you've been speaking of are both based on divine right, it seems. What difference does that make, if any, that you started off with a contrast between them and constitutional government?
I actually would I think the Saudis would deny, oddly enough, that their monarchy is based on divine right. They think that they have privileges because of their status as the guardians of holy places. But one of the odd characteristics of their government, theocratic though it appears to be, is that the royal family is considered above religion. The two things they're not supposed to touch are commerce and religion, and you can see this in funny ways. Where a friend of mine put it this way: he said, "You never see a Saudi royal doing his own shopping. He's supposed to make money, but not dirty his hands by going into business, and he's supposed to have the clerics at his beck and call, but not become one." So, one funny, possibly meaningful thing about MBS is that he's the first person to take the throne who has a beard, as opposed to a funny little goatee. And the beard, of course, is a mark of the clergy, and the decision not to take it is probably not coincidental. And then even with the caliph, the divine right, it phrases itself in a funny way. It's less that I am caliph, therefore my order is God's order, than I am caliph, therefore the obligation to have a pact with me, a contract with me, is God's order, but the contents of that contract and whether I fulfill it is on me, it's not on God. And so that there are a number of sidesteps that would prevent them from, in both cases, from thinking of divine right as the direct source of power.
Right. Avi Nelson.
Well, one comment when you were talking about the line of succession and how he said, I believe it. I expect that's what he would say to you, because otherwise all hell would have broken, whatever happens in Saudi Arabia would go, all hell would have broken out if the word had gotten out that he said, nah, don't worry, when the king's gone, I'll fix that up.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect him to say it as explicitly as that either.
No. The question I have is, what are the implications for us or in the United States for dealing with a country like this? How does that influence or inform our foreign policy as regards not only that country but that region?
Yeah, so if we think of foreign policy as influenced by shared values, then this strongly suggests that those values there's a real mismatch between the way we think about what matters and what they do. And I suppose I'm not surprised by that. People who have watched Saudi Arabia have for decades have long said the same thing, that Saudi Arabia is a different place with different, the very fact that they until recently have chopped people's hands off in public suggests they might be somewhat different from people of modern day Cambridge, Massachusetts. So what I think might be interesting is what it says about the shift in their views, the prospects for that shift. Clearly this point, which is about that the Crown Prince makes about the sociology of the kingdom, how it organizes itself with these miniature monarchies, I think that's true. That is the way that the kingdom has organized itself, and that means that it's not as if there's a democracy with an unfortunate king on the top, but that the values are deep and they are contrary to at every level to what yours might be or mine. That is not a good start for a long-term agreement and interest.
We have shared values, but we have some shared objectives.
Or interests, yeah.
In the Middle East, starting with oil, I suppose, going on from there. So if you were advising a president, assuming he would listen to you, what would you recommend? How do you approach a kingdom like this, where really they are starting from very different a priori assumptions about humankind and sort of the place of the state in the context of world configuration? What would you say?
So I would start by the points of the shared points. So many of the things that are happening in Saudi Arabia are just making Saudi Arabia more like the United States, more like the rest of the world. It's not the way often that they like to put it, but these social changes make Saudi Arabia resemble Dubai a little bit more, which in turn is, is halfway toward resembling Singapore, which is halfway toward resembling here. And that, given that there are enough shared interests, shared objectives, we can't easily disentangle ourselves from the rest of it. So I think we need to focus on those, encourage those changes when they happen. But the devil's bargain here, of course, is a familiar one, where if you want those nice things, if you want those shifts in our directions of values, then MBS has been quite clear that the price of that is no political change in your direction whatsoever. Instead, it's going to be a political change toward greater brutality and autocracy.
Peter.
Possibly broad question, but what do you think? So if the West, the West maybe can be compared fruitfully to, say, ancient Rome at some point in the latter half of its trajectory, dominant power that seems not to have the confidence in some ways that it once had, so forth. Can the Middle East, or at least the Arab Middle East, is there any basis for comparing it to the Germans? Is that somehow the future beacon?
Walk me through the comparison a bit more, if you would.
That if a place that's ruder, less genteel, certainly arguably less civilized, is somehow proves to be the crucible of something unfolding later that proves to have virtues that we perhaps once had, now have, might not have in the future.
The Middle East, and you say the Middle East rather than saying Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I
didn't want to put too much burden on Riyadh in that regard.
Let's say the Arab world, but
I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, I don't see any obvious virtues that are going to be preserved or incubated there. There's, when you talk to royals in Saudi Arabia, people who are invested in the system, you do notice that maybe this is what it would be like to have talked to some people who were part of a long-standing monarchic line, a robust monarchic line, and they do seem to have certain types of wisdom that might be lost about how one wields that power that almost certainly did exist in places where that form of government is long gone. That is an interesting thing to note, but it's much more in the sense of a curio rather than as a form of knowledge that someday will be useful to the rest of us.
maybe especially people and like I said, and possibly a broad question, but just the fact that the people seem to be more devout, say in the Arab Middle East than in the West. Now in some parts of Europe, there are more people going to mosques than to churches, and obviously that seems connected to other developments. Is there possibly a crucible of some sort of fidelity, innocence, whatever that is fruitful in the long term, or is it more? Was that not a fruitful way?
That is not my read on the situation. It's true that there is the prevalence of great religious devotion is notably high, not just in Saudi Arabia, by the way, but if you go to a nominally secular university in Cairo in the last couple decades, you'll notice that to find a equivalent rate of people saying that religion is deeply important to them on a daily basis, you go to Bob Jones University, not to Harvard, for the comparison, and that's an interesting thing. I don't know if it's something that gives us something to learn from. It's to me, no more than a sociologically interesting note. Martha.
With respect to either of these two organizations, Saudi Arabia and the Islamic State. I understood you to say that with respect to Saudi Arabia, there really is no understanding of divine right as the source of authority. I didn't hear quite what you had to say about the Islamic State, so I wonder if that's true also of the Islamic State. And secondly, I wondered with respect to the relationship between Islamic State and Saudi Arabia. Islamic State understood as the military arm of Islam, properly understood from their perspective. What is the relationship between those two? Are they at odds? Are they in some kind of equipoise? So those two questions. Divine right with respect to ISIS and the relationship between ISIS and Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. So I should be cautious in how I describe divine right with respect to the Islamic State. Obviously, they are claiming to be have the authority of God. So what could be more like a divine right than that? But what I'm specifically suggesting is not the case, is that they think that the caliph, one of which just recently got killed by Syrian by SDF forces just a few days ago, is somehow selected by God and has mystical powers. Instead, quite the opposite, that this is an ordinary person, and they'd sometimes even describe how odd it might be should a caliph arise who fulfills all the criteria, and he's the first one past the post, but he's just some random guy who thought to do it earlier than anybody else. So they say that could be the case. So they're really emphasizing that this is not someone who has an aura of election about him, but he is heading a state that does have that, and that creates a bunch of religious obligations. Now, the relationship between ISIS, Islamic State, and Saudi Arabia is an interesting one. I described that historiographical aspect where there's a divergence in understanding of what Islam requires. Saudi Arabia, for years subsequently, it has said, oh, you want to join the Taliban, you want to join Al-Qaeda, you want an Islamic government? We are the Islamic government you seek. So we don't agree with you that needs to happen. In fact, we consider you traitors, enemies of our state, by trying to go to it. However, but similarly, as I was saying to Harvey, the kings themselves are the reason that they have this power is entirely secular. That they were the ones who won a contest between humans, between tribes, and the ones who have power that way. What they benefit from is a clergy that reminds people of a historical obligation, of course contested, that says Muslims must give general obedience to a leader who is not actively telling them to get rid of Islam. And they say, look, we are fallible people. In fact, maybe we go off to Bahrain or to Vegas and do a lot of really un-Islamic things. But we're not telling you to do that. In fact, we're making it very possible for you to live a very pious life. Therefore, whether we ourselves are going to hell, you as a Muslim are religiously obliged to follow us to avoid the chaos of the absence of a leader. So when Saudi Arabia says, we are the Islamic State you seek, what they're really just saying is, we're allowing you in your own free time to do Islam, and we're making that as easy as possible. ISIS is making a much grander claim where they claim that there is a specific righteous government that they are, and that they fulfill prophecies by doing so. And everybody, not just people in their territory, who considers himself a Muslim, is obliged to go and be on their side. So these are irreconcilable views of the world that, in practice, Saudi Arabia, its conservatism, the theology that it exported looked a lot like ISIS theology. So, although they're irreconcilable, it's a matter of minor differences rather than not seeing eye to eye on big things.
Question. For a while, there was this thesis that the House of Saud was doomed because of this cycle where they depended so much on the clergy, and they would fund the clergy and back it and give it support, and segments of the clergy were so conservative, and then that would set up this dialectic, if you will, where the clergy are preaching to the people a very conservative form of the religion, but the royals themselves are becoming much more westernized and corrupt. Having these, you meet these people in LA and have drinking and marijuana and all kinds of things, and they're flaunting, and so that would lead to an uprising, a popular dissatisfaction, overthrow, partly fueled by righteousness. A righteous uprising, and perhaps in some ways similar to what befell the Shah of Iran. So that was one prediction. Now, and I was just wondering what your view is of the future, because there's also another thesis, which it seems like maybe you're leaning more to, would be more like the Montesquieu thesis, that the people themselves, I think you mentioned the English model, they gradually become used to things like women drive, social life, social changes like greater equality for women. They get more westernized in different ways through wealth and education and so forth. And the problem I have with that, though, is Saudi Arabia is so strange because of the dependence on oil. Are these people really bourgeois, independent types that are, going to cause a gradual exit from that? How do you see that? If you were advising the king.
Great question. I mean, this is where it becomes useful to just spend a lot of time hanging out around Saudi Arabia and seeing what people are actually doing, saying, thinking, what they're overhearing, what they say in literal and figurative senses. And I do think that the prior view of Saudi Arabia as having a lot of very conservative people who will never abide these changes, I think it just turned out to be wrong. And the reasons for our being wrong about that are themselves interesting. I mean, one reason so many people were wrong, and by the way, The Atlantic, for whom I wrote a cover story about Saudi Arabia, the previous cover story was the previous cover story about Saudi Arabia in The Atlantic's back issues was the fall of the House of Saud, prophesying an imminent fall because of all the tensions that those of us who were thinking about these things in 2004 were aware of. And when I went to Saudi Arabia, I copped to that immediately, by the way. I went to the Saudis and said, this is our last cover. We do want to do a little better than this in our predictability. So tried to be very open about that. One of the reasons that we thought, though, that the population was too conservative to allow any transition in directions that I like, that we were told so by the Saudis. We were told by members of the Saudi diplomatic corps, royal family, that we, the government, the monarchy, are the most liberal people in the kingdom, and you need to support us lest the popular rebellion take over. And it turns out the popular rebellion, in my experience, I just met a lot of people who were really thrilled about being able to go to a professional wrestling match, go to a rap concert, smoke pot, these are some of the more dramatic changes that were strictly forbidden in years past. But even things like when women were allowed to drive, this was an overnight thing, and there's a Saudi cleric who told a scholar of the country who asked him, "Why can't women drive?" He said, "Well, there's a lot of traffic on the roads right now. Imagine doubling it." That was his Sharia-based reasoning for not allowing women to drive. When women were allowed to drive, but the somewhat more moralistic reasons were, if you allow women to drive, they'll be able to just drive themselves to deserted street corners and be prostitutes. And this is the end, if you allow. That was the official line. And when it happened, not only did women start driving without incident, but, and I don't mean not hooking on street corners, there was no incident of women being yanked from their cars and beaten. There's no incident of cars being destroyed. So there seemed to be just a misread on the appetite for ordinary people for that kind of change. The second part of your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I could, so the people who then do this other model, it would be a gradual process where they become more like us and so forth. The problem, the question I have with Saudi Arabia in particular, it's unlike England, the welfare dependency, it's an unusual economy. So that these people are just getting huge checks from the king and so forth. So does that lend itself to a smooth transition away from monarchy, or they need to keep a very strong monarchy because they don't have any Republican,
So MBS, when he describes the economic changes in Saudi Arabia, he'll point to that. He'll say, we've been dependent on oil, and he'll say this has introduced lots of pathologies into our society. And it's also just bad for us to be dependent on one thing. And one of the things that he's been doing is changing the economy so it's diversified, so that Saudis actually work for a living rather than subsisting on patronage. And that whole patronage system, which was just the system. It was not, to us, it looks like corruption at a massive scale, but it was the system. that was how welfare worked before. So what he has, in effect, said is that you were right. That was corruption. And there were princes who were known for being thieves, generous thieves, who would take money from the public coffers and then hand it out to hundreds or thousands of people. And that system said, we're going to stop so that we have a diversified modern economy that allows, that supports these massive changes. Now, all that depends on actually making those changes successfully. And Saudi Arabia, surprise, surprise, remains dependent on oil, will remain dependent on oil for some time to come. But moving in the direction of those changes, for the reasons you state, are probably, if it actually works, it will be good for the prospects of shifting in moral, political, social directions that I like.
Well, Graeme, thank you so much for this, for your analysis and your insight into Saudi Arabia, the country of many new women drivers.
Thank you so
thanks
much.
very much for your comment.
Thank you.